It's obviously been a slightly amateur hour at the White House because they've added a journalist to this, what was supposed to be obviously a closed group, and no one seems to have noticed that until he himself outed himself, as it were. So that's a very worrying lack of professionalism at the center of the Trump administration.
It's astonishing to read the details of the top secret chat group that accidentally added a journalist. The US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth saying to the US Vice President, "I fully share your loathing of European freeloading. It's," and he employed capital letters for this, "pathetic." The US National Security Advisor sending a fist, an American flag and a fire. Then the US Special Envoy to the Middle East sending a flexed bicep. And all to Jeffrey Goldberg, editor-in-chief of The Atlantic, who wasn't sure if it was all real. He writes this: "According to the lengthy Hegseth text, the first detonations in Yemen would be felt 2 hours hence at 1:45 Eastern Time. So I waited in my car in a supermarket parking lot. If this signal chat was real, I reasoned, Houthi targets would soon be bombed. At about 1:55, I checked X and searched Yemen. Explosions were then being heard across Sana'a, the capital city." When Pete Hegseth was asked by journalists about the chat, here's what he had to say.
Why was those details shared on Signal, and how did you learn that a journalist was privy to the targets, the types of weapons used?
I've heard I was characterized. Nobody was texting war plans, and that's all I have to say about that. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Well, let's speak to Sir Mark Lyall Grant, the former National Security Advisor to the UK, former permanent representative of the UK to the UN. Let me just start with this question. In all your experience, have you ever heard anything quite like this?
No, it is very unusual, to say the least, Danny.
That's
it is true that in the sort of modern government, this form of sort of informal communication between ministers, between leaders, has become quite common. But it is very unusual, obviously, to be discussing sort of more secret defense matters, and secondly, for it to be sort of leaked in this obvious way by incompetence, by adding a journalist to the actual group.
Can I just ask, this extraordinary assertion that the Defence Secretary is making, which is that he didn't share war plans, it seems obvious from what Jeffrey Goldberg is saying that isn't true, that itself is a lie. Is that how it strikes you as well, or is there something about the word war plans that I'm not understanding?
Well, it does appear that he gave in advance the timing of the attack, but whether he actually gave sort of targeting information, etc., that I don't know. We haven't seen that, at least I haven't seen that on anything that's been published. So maybe it's a question of definitions, but there's no doubt that defense and intelligence matters have been shared on a communications channel, Signal, which obviously shouldn't have been used for that information. And in fact, a couple of years ago, the Pentagon specifically said that Signal should not be used for anything that was in the classified zone.
So can you explain to us how serious this is? Because to help us understand, at a more than common sense level, how dangerous it is for a piece of information like that to be released in this way.
Well, I think there's three levels of concern, particularly for the Europeans. I mean, the first is that there is a potential real security risk, because if these plans had been leaked and the timings had been leaked to someone sympathetic to the Houthis, they could have, of course, been tipped off in advance, and that could have jeopardized the success or otherwise of the military operation. So there is a real potential security risk. The second layer of concern is the fact that it's obviously been a slightly amateur hour at the White House because they've added a journalist to this, what was supposed to be obviously a closed group, and no one seems to have noticed that until he himself outed himself, as it were. So that's a very worrying lack of professionalism at the center of the Trump administration. And the third level of concern for the Europeans is the rather casual dismissal of Europe that we saw from senior political leaders.
I suppose most of us, if we have confidential information, it's never that confidential, so we probably would use WhatsApp or Signal. How would a piece of information like this normally be handled? I mean, obviously you can't give us away too much, but you can give us an idea.
Well, there are secret forms of communication, also secure forms of communication that are used for this type of information, i.e. a closed and what's called a supervised network, a monitored network. The trouble with Signal, although it is more secure because it uses end-to-end encryption than, for instance, WhatsApp or just a normal text message, it is, however, what's called unmanaged. And that means there is no one monitoring that account, seeing who is receiving and sending those messages. And that's what makes it vulnerable. So it would never be used in the UK for this sort of information. But as I say, in the modern era, one has to be honest and say that government leaders do use WhatsApp messaging, other forms of communication in a sort of group amongst themselves, as we've seen from MPs just recently in the UK.
What does this mean for UK-US intelligence sharing? I mean, for many years after the Cambridge spies, James Jesus Angleton of the CIA became obsessed with the idea that there were moles in the system, and it led to the US probably still now not fully trusting UK security. What do you think our response should be to learning that the US is so sloppy with its intelligence?
We're worried about this aspect of it because intelligence is shared between the intelligence agencies. So British intelligence would be shared with the American intelligence agencies. And I think what one can assume from this particular episode is that the American intelligence agencies are going to be reading the Riot Act to some of the political leaders and saying, look, you must not treat information in this way. So I'm not concerned about the sharing of intelligence between professional intelligence agencies on both sides of the Atlantic.
Let me just ask about the content of these messages, because it was pretty striking what they had to say about Europe. It suggests that the things that they're saying in public, they're saying to each other. In that way, it was quite revealing because we learned that they really are talking of Europe in the terms that we most feared. What was your reaction to hearing, them using terms like pathetic to describe the US and the UK and other European countries' defence postures?
Yes, as you say, Danny, I don't think we heard anything particularly new, as it were, because much of that has been said in public before. But it is a reaffirmation of this sort of broad contemptuous approach that some leaders in Washington have towards the European countries. Because what they say in private, one can assume, isn't just done for effect, it's actually what they really think. So it is worrying to see those sorts of terms being used, as indeed it was quite worrying to see what people assuming to have been Steve Miller saying that the Americans would expect to get paid in some way for defending international shipping, and they ought to be looking for ways to recoup the military cost of this sort of operation.
Well, Sir Mark Lyall Grant, former National Security Advisor to the UK, former permanent representative of the UK to the UN, thank you very much for shedding light on that really quite extraordinary story.